Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ice Time, where we talk about some of the big ideas around the NHL. I'm Mike Fink, and I'm joined by Harrison Smajovits, who covers the Tampa Bay Lightning and does a whole bunch of things, well, at the Hockey Writers and a whole bunch of sports things in general. And before I ask how you're doing, I actually am reminded, have you seen on social media the clips of players introducing themselves with their names, where it's like, this is their name, and they say it in the original accent? We feel awful, like, well, wow, we don't know how to pronounce the name. And for me, I'm thinking in my head, like, I'm doubling down on some of their names. Have you? I don't know if you've seen that or not, but I just was reminded of that having you on. Harrison, how are you doing?
It's pretty good and it's funny. Like when you mentioned that, I first thought of like when you turn on an NFL game and it says like, Mike Evans, Texas A&M or something
Yeah.
like that. Except, it's you turn the difficulty up a little bit with my name. So, I really gave you a doozy to start things.
No, and there's the funniest ones are you get some of the teams where, like, the Minnesota Wild did one, for example, and you have Philip Gustafson, who I just pronounced wrong, or anyone with the name Jesper, but it's Jesper. I'm doubling down. Like this, it's Jesper. I'm just gonna call it Jesper. One of the beauties is getting these names wrong, and then you get like Brock Faber, where it's like Brock Faber. Brock Faber. Anyway, I digress on that. It's the Olympic break, so this is a good time to talk about something that's not related to the NHL right now, but just in general. And I wanted to have you on for it because we're going to talk about how Florida became a destination and how why Florida is now the markets, the two teams that nobody wants to face, and everyone's like they're the juggernauts of the NHL. I know the Florida Panthers are not having a good season, but the past five Stanley Cups, the past six Stanley Cups in the Eastern Conference, there's been a Florida team in the final. They've won four of those. So they've become the juggernauts, the Lightning and the Panthers. I want to start with this, which is, I don't know how long you followed hockey, but do you remember the days, what it was like before the Lightning were good, before I guess Steve Eisenman arrived? And you certainly remember the days of the Panthers, but talk about those days, just because I think that's important to provide context of what Florida was before they really had this all these advantages working in their favor.
All right, so we're going back a little bit. Fortunately, as someone who's been, who was raised on hockey from a young age, father was a Montreal Canadiens fan, somehow still ended up with a Tampa Bay Lightning fan as a son, but here we are. Um, it's just like everything with the Lightning there is a very specific before and after period, like a BC and an AD or a BCE, however you want to do it. And it's before Jeff Vinik and after Jeff Vinik. And I say this knowing that, like, with Gary Davidson, they did win a Stanley Cup in 2004. They made the playoffs in the Thunderdome. They had their playoff teams before that, the championship caliber. But the biggest thing was the Lightning were not always a profitable team. One man finally came in and found the magic touch. And a big part of it too is like, let alone are we trying to sell hockey as something to watch? He realized you gotta make the whole thing an experience. So like when I was a little kid going to games, it was, just any hockey game. Like here you are, you have your standard hype up stuff, but let's see, like the Tesla coils eventually came in. You had the bigger updated scoreboards, the organ. He found that like under his ownership, and we'll see how things go as the team transfers to new majority owners in the next couple of years, how that'll continue. But that's been like ownership is everything, is what I've learned. And I can even compare that to other teams in the Tampa Bay area from when I was growing up, whether it's the Rays or the Bucks. It all came to how can we put on a good product that's entertaining, be a just have a high standard that gets people to come in because one thing that didn't help with the Lightning for their attendance, like at the beginning, there was intrigue. It's a new sport. It's at the baseball stadium. People were packing in, and then you get to the Ice Palace. They're not as good after the Stanley Cup in 2004. Attendance does dip for a few years, but now even if there's times where the Lightning aren't necessarily as good as a Stanley Cup contender that they were earlier in the decade, they're still having all these consecutive sellouts. They've managed to get the Stadium Series, and it all started with the fact that you had an owner who was willing to just put in the investment to create what, and it says it when you enter the building, it's all about being a world-class organization, and they have walked the walk.
It's interesting because that it starts up top, and that's with a lot of these things where it's the ownership willing to spend. You could say the same about the Panthers too, when I think they had the same ownership was once they started investing in the team, things really changed. And with the Panthers, it's more recent where it's 2020, 2021, around then when you start seeing the effects of things. And the Lightning, you really have to go back. And it's around 2012, 13 when you start to see the effects of good ownership and good a good front office. And it's interesting because with both of these teams, I wonder when you start to notice there's some teams that it's they get hot and they have a good season or they play well for a while, but when you start noticing tangible differences, when do you think that happened?
So just like when did we start to notice that like
When you start to notice the teams that's good and consistently good, because I think both teams, I think what's interesting is that both teams they built up a good foundation, whether it's by drafting well or you build up your core. You have that there. You have that there with your roster. But you're not going to sustain a good team for years just by doing that. You have to add the other things around that, and obviously an ownership willing to spend and not cut corners anywhere from on the ice, off the ice. That helps. I think what's interesting is when you start to notice that impact, because I think it takes a while till fans
for
start to see
sure.
that. So I'm wondering when you probably would notice around for the Lightning, it's probably around 2013, 14 when they start making deep playoff runs. Because I think before that, they had spurts where obviously the Stanley Cup title in 2004, I believe. You have spurts of greatness, and you have Marty St. Louis, Vinny Lecavalier. You had those years where they've had those spurts of it, but to be sustainable, something has to change, and I think I'm wondering when that happened, when you noticed that happen.
So apart also like just want to throw in there was like that Eastern Conference final run in like 2011. That was kind of like in between where you had like Marty and like Cavalier, but you also had Stamkos and Victor Hedman. Really, a lot of times it's like you see there's two things. You look at like the types of like depth pieces they're bringing in, or are they potentially developing down in the AHL? Because by the time you get to 2013 or 14, suddenly, this undrafted Tyler Johnson's coming in. The second round pick of Nikita Kucherov's coming in. This lower round pick of Andre Palat is coming in. And these young depth pieces with a lot of room for growth are coming into the team. And key trades, and you can look to one for the Lightning and one for the Panthers, the one that you can say that's where things truly got going. They're not quite equal, but if you ask like someone in who follows these franchises, I like to think these are the ones. For the Lightning, everything changed with the acquisition of Ben Bishop in a trade for Corey Conacher with the Senators during the 2012-13 season. They made some moves to acquire a goalie, see what happens. There's at the same time there's this new interim coach named John Cooper who's coming in from Syracuse to help get to the end of the season. Turns out these two additions mid-season changed everything. Suddenly the Lightning have a goalie. They have a head coach who's still there to this day. For the Panthers, they were already good before this move. They had already won the President's Trophy. But I feel like just that trade for Matthew Tkachuk was what took a good team and made it championship caliber. Because it was like you took a player who was the right fit for this certain system and brought a certain personality to the table that just brought them over the top. And I think you can look to key moments, and it's hard to necessarily see them in real time outside of, oh, hey, this team's starting to win a little bit. It's more in hindsight, you can kind of put the pieces together and say, this was the turning point. This move here, this call up there, this hire here are when everything changed and suddenly these teams are on the upswing.
I think what's interesting is because you talked about the era where the Lightning had that Eastern Conference Final run where they had Stamkos and Hedman. Both the Lightning and the Panthers, every team's going to draft at least find a few pieces in the draft. I mean, naturally, some teams draft poorly year in and year out, but generally you're going to find those pieces there. The Lightning was Stamkos and Hedman. For the Panthers, they had Barkov around for a while. They had him at number one. They took him at number one, I believe, in 2014 range, the 2014 range, or somewhere around there. And they had Aaron Ekblad too. They also drafted in the top five. And then after that, it's okay. How do you assemble the pieces after that? And it is those splash trades sometimes. You do have to take a swing. That's where I guess you finding the right GM, that checking that box. Ownership is one thing, checking off another box is the GM who's willing to make that move and willing to make that swing. And then it's finding those pieces out there. You mentioned the development process, and I think that's an interesting one I want to throw out there, which is one of the things that I think really changed both for Tampa and Florida is what makes it sustainable is when you have that development plan and process in place. For the Lightning, it's interesting. It's not coincidental that when they moved to Syracuse, all of a sudden they have all those depth pieces ready to go, or they have those players that with prospects that take a step forward, whether it's Radish or Palat or I believe Yanni Gord, for example, is another one that they were in Syracuse for a while. They weren't star players. When you're a team like Tampa or you're a team like Florida, you know you're not drafting in the top five anymore. Once you're this good, you know it's not happening. You have to develop. You have to have that plan in place, and you have to have that culture in place. And with Tampa, with Syracuse, and with Florida, I think it's Charlotte, where when they move to Charlotte, obviously it's not the best move for the AHL level, where you have to travel all the time. You have games where if it snows, which it's done a few times this year, you have to have games postponed and canceled, which has happened a few times this year. But Charlotte's been an ideal fit for Florida, where it's close, but it's close enough for their call-ups to help develop their prospects and allow them to have that extra layer of depth. And they kind of made that move also recently in the 2020 decade, earlier in the decade. So you're just your thoughts on that because I think that makes a huge difference. That really is a tangible shift, and that's what I think other teams can copy.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with the whole developmental aspect of it. Because like look at the Lightning, like let alone are they no longer gonna have top five picks. They're not even having top 32 picks right now because they keep trading away first round picks. I think their next one is in 2028 after they traded a couple of them for coincidentally to bring back Yanni Gordon and get Oliver Bjorkstrand.
I think didn't what's name Breeze Bloss say something along the lines of, I don't care about first round picks. We're a cup contender every year," or something along
Yeah,
those lines.
exactly. Like when you have the core and you know how to develop the pieces, do you necessarily, is it nice to have a first round pick? Sure. And that's why they kept one around to take Isaac Howard, which, look how well that one went if you really want to split hairs here. But you mentioned Julian Brisebois. Also, just like the ability of this one of these general managers, for example, to one, not just develop the talent, maybe see a diamond in the rough and work with that because, we always talk about the Iser plan and everything like that, but Breesball was the assistant GM for him. He was in charge of what was happening in Syracuse. There's a reason why he was put in charge when Iserman took that advisor role for a year and then went to Detroit. Just like that eye for talent, knowing what to do, seeing what can they make of someone. Like for example, a forward from this year they signed right before the season, Dominic James. No, I guarantee you, no Lightning fan had heard of him until he got signed, and then it turns out he's a nice piece for the bottom six. He left Chicago to go take a gamble somewhere else. The Lightning saw an opportunity, and it's worked out. Same thing with Dastus. It's like you don't know where most of these players come from, but then they're able to be these nice contributing players. You mentioned Radish. He was undrafted. He was in juniors for what, 4 or 5 years?
Uh, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, he was one of those players that took a while. I mean, there's also a player like juniors, Matt, I believe Matthew Olivier, for example, was in juniors for a while. What's interesting, you're talking about players that diamonds in the rough. I know it wasn't a development case, but Brandon Hagel, they trade for him, and then
Yes.
he works out the way he worked out. And it's interesting because you talk about Brisebois, and he's been there for a bit, and I think it's interesting is that you not just have Breeze Ball there, but it's the GMs in or the front office that they've had for years in Syracuse. You look at Matthew Darsh, you look at Stacey Roast. Matthew Darsh, who's now the GM of the Islanders, and non coincidentally, he's there, and immediately they're one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference. And you could say the same about, I mean, Stacey Roast actually is now in Rochester. He was another person that people were wondering, where is he going to go? Because he's another great mind at the developmental level, and he goes to Rochester with the Sabres when they turn over everything. And non-coincidentally, the Sabres have been good since he's gone there. And it's interesting now is that their GM now is their head coach. It's a little interesting to see. But for the Lightning on a developmental standpoint, is they have prospects, they have scouts or talent evaluators always in the building. And I think that's a huge difference. You'll notice the teams that there are teams that you can notice at these levels have prospects, have scouts in the building every night versus the ones that don't do that. And it's the cutting corners. And I know like a lot of things are about analytics, and analytics are a big part of hockey, but the fact is you to have players, have people there every night, that's something that does make a difference. The Lightning are one of those teams. The Panthers are to a lesser degree one of those teams. They do it more. They do more of their scouting, I'd say, in the South, where the Southern teams where they have people traveling in those hubs. But the point being that you still have those eyes there. That it's like that you could say they have just to have that a little extra intel on these players or have a little more of an understanding of them where they see them every night, and it does make a difference. It's just it really shows. And I feel like I cut you off there for a bit.
No, no, you're good. No, no, you got the idea there. It's like, the teams that have the fingers on the pulse are the ones who are going to pick up on it and get a read. And you mentioned Hagel, by the way. Talk about like those risks and taking a swing. Sixth round pick, had about 20, was coming into a season where he had about 20 goals. It was sort of a breakout year. And they go and they take the risk of trading two first round picks and two forwards for him just to make it work with the roster and the salary cap situation. And at the time when it first happened, like it rose eyebrows. Like the Lightning weren't, this was before the Tanner Jeannot trade and some of the other bigger swings that may or may not have worked out, but that's beside the point. Is it also a lot? That big one was the Hagel one. They before that they had done like, okay, a first round pick went for Coleman and one went for Goodrow, but this was a four pieces going in exchange for a potential good goal scorer, and then you throw in the fourth round pick with it just so you have some kind of draft capital. And they've certainly gotten more out of him than they probably ever could have imagined because now he's someone who's pushing for 80, 90, maybe one year he gets a 100-point season. And, and for someone who's brought in to be, a future key piece to the offense, but also just depth for a cup final run, like that just shows like the willingness to take a swing, having the eye for talent, like you said, and then also just like knowing how to develop them further once you have them, as opposed to you got a ready-made piece to go from someone else.
How big of an advantage do you think state taxes are?
It's funny. That was the question I thought about the most before hopping on here.
That's why I waited a bit.
Yes. So, do they play a factor? I can't say no entirely because, let's just say all things being equal, you're shown some contracts, you can punch the numbers, you know, bing, bang, boom, you get that. But I don't think it's as big of a factor as a lot of people make it out to be. And here's what I do think does play a bit more of a role. Let's just say you have two Stanley Cup contenders. One plays in sunny Tampa, Florida, where it's 75 degrees in December and January. You can go for a jog in your shorts and t-shirts, or you can go to Edmonton or Calgary, where it's much colder. You're inside, or you can take it up a notch and say Winnipeg, where it could be minus 50. It doesn't matter Celsius or Fahrenheit. Which one just sounds more appealing? You can go win a Stanley Cup where it's lovely all year round and you can go to the beach, or do you want to tough out the cold? And like I know there's some teams that still will choose wherever, maybe you're from Canada, you want to stay in Canada, and I think that's a very reasonable thing to decide upon. But I think, that lifestyle ability just is a much more enticing reason than maybe potentially the taxes, which, at one point too, like like how much of a factor might it be compared to, let's say, a state income tax somewhere else? It might be, oh, that one's 3.5%. I want to go to this other state and do that instead.
I find it fascinating. Here's why I find my one of the things that I've been discussing with people in general is that if it's a tiebreaker where all things are equal, where both teams have pretty much the same team, but one has that no tax state versus the taxes that will decide things. Or for some people, it's dependent on the type of market where there's a lot of pressure in Edmonton, there's a lot of pressure in Montreal, a lot of pressure in Toronto to win. The highs are high, but when they win there, the highs are high. And obviously, you look at smaller markets, the lows are low where you look at Arizona, how it failed, and I believe they have all the same pros that Florida has, but they couldn't make it work. They didn't have the ownership. They didn't have the competent ownership. It starts there. What I find fascinating about the tax conversation, just because I mean I follow other sports, you obviously follow other sports, you don't hear this conversation in any other sport at all. This is funny. It's the funniest thing. It's so hockey specific because we both follow baseball, for example. I have never heard a player go to the Miami
Never.
Marlins or the Tampa Bay Rays because there is a tax-free state that you don't have to pay taxes for. Where are people going? It's a different conversation, but they're going to LA where it's, oh, there's going to be a lockout because they spend so much and they're they can defer payments, which I guess is a different type of discussion where you can defer payments and take advantage of that, which every team should be able to do, but not everyone does, which is a different thing. But you never hear of it in baseball. In football, same football has a salary cap. I get it, it's a rising cap, and basketball's the same way, but you never hear of players want to go to Florida or players want to go to a specific city because there's no taxes there. You just never hear it. And in hockey, that's all you hear about. Where it's, I mean, you do think that that hockey players had a hockey player tax, where it was if you play hockey versus playing baseball, you have to get taxed a certain amount because you play the sport. And it's fascinating because you hear this conversation, you're like, why? I'll just throw that out there, which is why.
Yeah, no, it's definitely worth putting out there because like you don't hear this in other sports. And like honestly, you mentioned the Dodgers, which California with the taxes they can have just in state income tax. It reminds me of when Freddie Freeman was deciding where he was going to go after he became a free agency after they won in Atlanta in 2021. There was that discussion of like, the Dodgers are definitely in on him, but they're saying like the Rays might be in on him too. The reports of like, it might be this 4-year deal worth this amount. The Dodgers are paying him potentially this amount here. That's the only case for at least in Major League Baseball where I can recall where I think taxes came up whatsoever. Like it came up once or twice toward the end. Because in the end, like, he's from the West Coast. The Dodgers gave him the extra year. It was an easy decision for him after all. But outside of that one time, I cannot think of one instance in which there was a genuine discussion of our tax is an issue because like no one's exactly flocking to the Diamondbacks either. Like, they spend more than the Rays do, but it's no one saying, "Oh wow, this super team's going to develop for Arizona because of this tax haven that it is." So I've never understood why it's such a big argument in the NHL.
It's so it and the other teams aside from the Dodgers that spend a lot, who else spends a lot? The Yankees spend a lot. Boston spends a lot. The Phillies spend a lot. I mean, it's funny. We're becoming a baseball podcast now, which I guess, like, maybe you probably said, we could do a baseball podcast for why not in the middle of February when it's cold and we're getting ready for spring training and baseball and stuff like some of us are. I mean, I'm still into the hockey season, but point being that those teams that you don't hear of it even in the other sports in basketball you don't hear of players wanting to go to I mean players want to go to Miami or Phoenix in basketball. I haven't followed sport in a while to know if they are going there or not, but they would go there because they're winning or if they were winning not, and that's the big deciding factor. It's interesting. I should say as a preface or as a something worth noting is that Baseball doesn't have a salary cap. Maybe they'll get one. We'll see what happens. But I mean, I hope not, because I mean the players will not want one. But
No,
baseball doesn't have a salary.
that's a whole discussion. That's a whole episode in its all own
That's a
right.
whole episode. Maybe we'll have to call it. We'll have to change the name of this podcast if we're doing that. But baseball doesn't have a salary cap. Football has one, but not really, in the sense that the cap, because it goes up every year so much. The salary cap goes up every year to the point where people sign a bad contract and then a few years later, like, whatever, we could eat it or we could buy it out. It's not a big deal. The cap doesn't really exist for football the same way it does for hockey. And basketball, the same way. The cap goes up every year, and also there's limited roster spots anyway, so you could spend big, and then there's only so many spots you could fill. So it's not like, oh wow, compared to hockey, it's 20 roster spots. In basketball, it's like really a few big players taking on a few big contracts, and that's it. So it's a little different roster structure wise. But I think what's interesting about that is that hockey for years has had this flat cap with a hard cap league, and it was the only league that had that. So you could say that in a hard cap league where the contracts are staying the same for everyone and they aren't changing, players have to make a decision. And for a few years, they've had this decision to make from 2020 when the cap really froze and it stayed at what 82 or whatever it was, 84 until then. Do you think I guess with that in mind, do you think that things will change there because the cap is going up, and I think the cap can continue to rise unless anything changes? Do you think things can change for Florida as well, or for these teams that quote unquote have this tax advantage where we won't hear about it in a few years because the cap keeps going up, and if it does?
Yeah. I mean, you can definitely make the argument both ways, where if you're a team like the Lightning and you're stuck with the frozen cap and trying to navigate for a few years, and you're not necessarily able to make some of those signings, maybe now that the cap's pushing toward 100, over 100, like maybe they try to play that advantage. I just want to like swing the argument that way as part of the discussion. But also as the cap goes up in general, like let's say you're the Rangers and you're looking to outbid. If you guys have more salary cap space, it's like, look, you're one of the most profitable organizations in the NHL. You're just going to go take that swing. And I think just there's always going to be someone who's going to want to make that argument. But I think once the cap starts to skyrocket and everyone in these markets with the money has the chance to take that swing, they're going to be able to do it. And I think if a couple contracts go in favor of a couple of teams up north, then I do think the conversation will start to die down a bit.
I think it's interesting. It could be a subsequent change. That's something we don't notice, but the fallout from it. And the thing I think about, we're really talking about a lot of different sports here on this podcast, is college football. For if I told you years ago that Indiana would win the national championship, you'd say I'm crazy. But if I told you it happened because of some changes in the system, one of them being that players can be paid, you'd say, oh yeah, that could make sense. But that could work. You could talk yourself into it. I think it's that subsequent change that's something we didn't notice, not coincidentally, by the way, in college football. I haven't followed it as much either. Another sport I haven't really followed as much because I follow hockey a lot. Non coincidentally, though, the last three teams that have won the national championship have won it in the Midwest. It's Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, three states that are in the Midwest. It used to be the Southeastern Conference would win it all the time. Anyway, I digress. But it's that subsequent change. And with a rising cap, we might see something where it's not effective immediately, but over time, you start to see some teams that used to dominate and used to get those players that were those teams that signed everyone would now aren't getting them, and some other teams that weren't good for a while all of a sudden are. Over time, you start to see that. I want to wrap up with a question. We're running a little low on time, so I want to ask you, what do you think the rest of the league can learn from Florida? And I think to add to that, if a team goes to Houston or a team goes to Atlanta, two markets that are in the conversation and would have the same advantages that Florida has, what can all these teams learn from the Florida teams?
Well, I definitely can say too, especially for Atlanta, with the mistakes that were made there, it's all about the investments. All like whether it's Arizona or Houston or Atlanta or even Sunrise because their success is more relatively recent. The Lightning, the Hurricanes, maybe even more the Lightning because the Hurricanes weren't as good for a while. Their attendance has been climbing up again more recently. It just shows if you're in a market that is not traditionally hockey, it pays to invest in the product. Same thing with Vegas, by the way. They come in instantly a winner. I was in Las Vegas about 4 months ago. Hockey is everywhere. It's not just Golden Knights merch. Like there's just random hockey games in casinos now because they got in, they got everyone interested one way or another, and now it's everywhere. And I think it's been sustained long enough for like, sure, if the Lightning aren't as good, are you gonna maybe that sellout streak will end? Vegas will probably see somewhat of an attendance dip at times if they're not as good. But by this point, because they've sold a mass audience on the product, all these things, it shows that enough of them will stick around. As long as the team shows that they're in it to invest in the quality. Even if they're saying like, hey, it's going to be a rough couple of years, but the goal is to retool and build something better. It's not just constantly, why won't they do anything? That's when the fans will keep coming. Keep them interested, show that you're invested, and if you build it, they will come.
But yeah, I mean and you talk about Vegas, and interestingly, a team that also started up recently that hasn't had that success, Seattle. So it just shows you. And Seattle, by the way, in terms of just a fun fact about Seattle is that they don't have state taxes. So like the team that doesn't have them, it's like and they can't make it work. It just shows you like starts at the top, it works its way down. What's fascinating about hockey, and I got the only other sport you could say the same thing about is baseball, is that you can't just draft your way to the top. You have to you in basketball or football you could do that, but in hockey and baseball you have to draft, you have to develop, you have to spend up top of the ownership group, and you need a good front office that's willing to build in multiple ways. You need a good coaching. You need everything, and that's what's fascinating about these teams. It's about Florida and about Tampa, and if a team goes to Houston or Atlanta or wherever it goes, it's going to be fascinating to see because you can't there's not just one way to build, or you have to build in multiple ways to win in hockey, and it's really what's fascinating about it. That's all we got. And Harrison, this was fun. We got a lot covered, well, a lot of ground covered in 40 minutes, so I really appreciate you hopping on. Any plugs while you're at it? Plug away.
You can check me out for hockey on the Hockey Writers, Tampa Bay Lightning page. You can find me there at the top. If you're interested in hearing about some baseball, I do some Atlanta Braves coverage on Atlanta Braves on SI. I also do Florida Gators coverage, which is also on the On SI channel. So that's my college football, that's my hockey, that's my baseball. You can find me there if you want to hear more from me.
I really it was really good to pick you for this topic because all the cross sports references really come into play when you're following the other sports and you're on top of that stuff as well. So yeah, it was great. It was a great discussion. Really enjoyed this one. Really enjoyed putting this one together. So, but for now, that's all we got. We hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, Mike Fink Hockey Writer, which putting up some videos, uploading some shorts, which is cool too. So check all that out and check out my content, Hockey Hot Stove. You can check out Harrison's at the Hockey Writers. A lot of great stuff on the Lightning, and check out the other sports too because those are also good. But until next time, we hope you enjoyed and tune in next time for another great episode. Thank you.